whether it's designing footwear or designed a lot of consumer electronics, they're sold on the shelf at Best Buy or Target. This process is so different, right? We're designing something that has to appeal to an architect or an interior designer. They specify it, right? Like it has to go through client approvals, like so many levels, and we don't find out if we made a successful product till like 3 years later.
Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we are speaking with Michael DiTullo, an industrial designer that has recently worked with Kirei acoustic tiles and creating some really interesting acoustic features for architectural design to go in a building near you. But Michael is an industrial designer with a high degree of talent and introspection into all things design. And this was an insanely interesting interview that I was really happy we got to do. This guy sat in the presence of Michael Jordan and worked with him on his shoes. So yeah, that's pretty awesome. Check it out. We had a great interview with Michael. Really, really liked it. And I bet you will too. Michael DiTullo, welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Happy to have you here today. You have designed some stuff for notable companies and such, people with high regard for design. So you must have some talent, apparently. And there's apparently designs that you've worked on behind you that I'd like to hear more about.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just love what I do. I'm lucky that I knew I wanted to do this from a young age. I've always just been fascinated by the future and what things will be like in the future. And I love working across so many industries. And for me, I've never been one to specialize. So I feel really fortunate that I've been able to craft a career where I can work on everything from watches to electric boats.
I mean, you have houses, furniture, shoes, bikes, watches, computers, or toaster. I'm not sure what that is. Nice big house. Look at that. And
a little bit of everything.
What is that? Like the one right to your right there, is that the center console of a car in the middle?
Yeah, this is a center console for a vintage Mustang to be able to adapt to have a screen.
Nice.
and take some more high-tech stuff. And then these were some armrest concepts. It was a project I was working on for a company in LA called Icon.
I love Icon.
Okay.
Like the Land Cruisers that they do and stuff like that. Just amazing stuff. That's awesome. So you've done stuff for them too.
Yeah, I worked with Jonathan Ward, who's the founder there, for about 12 years on a bunch of different projects. That one was for a proposal we worked on to do basically an Icon version of a Bullitt Mustang. So that one didn't come to fruition, but we have worked on dozens of projects together.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that idea of... See, I've had this weird idea where I've continually wanted to buy cars that are about 20 years old, simply because if you look in the last 20 years, you can more easily identify the cars that have become slightly iconic.
For sure. More
than like making a bet on a new car.
Yeah.
And there's just something about a little bit older car with the ability to say this has stood the test of time, even for just 20 years, that for some reason it made... They're cheaper because they're not completely cool yet. They're only 20 years old. So they're basically like trash at this point, but they've got some unique lasting quality to them that to me has always been interesting.
Yeah, I drive a 2001 Audi TT Quattro, and
there you go.
It's just really in the last couple of years taking it places where people are like, oh wow, what's that? Because it's old enough to be kind of rare, where a lot didn't make it.
Right.
But yeah, that's I don't know. I kind of feel the same way. 20 years is a good amount of time.
So tell me a little bit about your background and what you feel was very important about your background to allow you to get to the point where you've been able to work on stuff like that.
I think,
Feel free to go all the way to childhood, by the way.
yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Trent. I think when I was a kid, I just loved drawing things. And I used to literally I'd come, I was a latchkey Gen X kid. I'd come home from school and pop on cartoons and get out a TV tray and the old Sears catalog, and which, for those of you who are too young to know what that is, was basically Amazon, but if it was a book that you get once a year. And I'd open up the Sears catalog to a random page and be like, oh, okay, drills. And I'd be like, well, I try to think to myself, I wonder what drills would be like in the future.
Whoa.
And I'm like 10 years old. So little did I know, I'm like basically being an industrial designer before I knew what that was. And when I was about 13, my family asked me what I wanted to do when I grow up, and I said I wanted to draw stuff from the future. I didn't know how to describe it. I just figured that must be somebody's job. And so a few weeks later, my dad happened upon an article about Giorgio Giugiaro, who's an Italian industrial designer, and he was like, is this what you want to do? And I lucked out that I learned so young what it was.
Wow. How awesome is that your parents were forward thinking and aware enough to look at what you identified with and what you were interested in, and to find like a place for you to channel that into, to give you help you with your own dream that you showed interest in. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Very fortunate. I was very fortunate. I grew up about an hour and a half north of New York City, straight up the Hudson. For whatever reason, my high school had a ton of great classes. They had a design drawing class, which was basically like industrial design. You had to do like concepts and then show people and do surveys. A really good architectural drafting course. I thought I might want to go into architecture for a while. I've always just been fascinated by buildings and interiors and how people kind of move through spaces and live with them. So I was very lucky to have identified it so young, to have been in a school, even though it was kind of a country bumpkin school. Like our a lot of my friends like grew up on like apple orchards and things, but for whatever reason, I had this school experience where I got to learn how to draft things, how to think about things three-dimensionally and represent them two-dimensionally. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, I'm still just the professional version of that kid. I love working with clients and understanding what makes them unique. I really try to like spend as much time as possible with them to pull out from them what's special that they didn't even, they almost disregarded because they're too close to it. I've had my own consulting practice for about 5 years now, and my policy is we only ever take 3 clients at a time, because I feel like I can give about 30% of my time to each client.
Right. So you just save 10% for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. And any more than that, it starts to get a little too diffuse.
Is that what you do full time now? Is independent contractor essentially for industrial design?
Yeah, industrial design, and as well as bleeds into brand positioning and creative direction. So for Kirei, which is the client that kind of brought us together, they make architectural wall and ceiling systems. I've been working with them for about 3 years, and I work with them from everything from kind of innovation planning and product design all the way through to kind of product positioning for the marketing department, branding, and then creative direct all the photo shoots, and even approve outgoing emails and things like that. So
are you telling me you get to work creatively, design and create without being a full-time employee?
Yeah, basically. So I do that for about 3 clients at a time. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So how does one get into that position?
I love the classic IDEO framework of kind of like being a T-shaped person. So, the deep vertical of my T is obviously industrial design. Right out of college, I worked for a small consulting firm that did a lot of work with Burton, snowboards, Bose, Nike. I was there for about 4.5 years. Nike brought me in-house, and I worked with worked first at Nike Sportswear, which is really interesting because, this giant company, but sportswear was kind of a startup at the time. Creating lifestyle products was like a new concept. So helping to kind of scale that team up. And then I went over to the Jordan team, which was right after Michael kind of retired.
Wow. Have you been in the same room with Michael Jordan?
I've spent much time with him. Yeah.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. I worked with Michael. I worked with Carmelo Anthony,
wow.
Dwayne Wade, Derek Jeter. But my mentor at Nike was like, hey, Michael, why do you want to go to Jordan? I mean, it was doing about 500 million in sales at the time. Michael retired. It might shrink. And I was like, no, John, I think it's going to grow because we're going to take Michael and turn him from a person and convert him into an idea.
Yeah, an idea, an icon, a legend.
And it about doubled in size in that time to about $1 billion. And that was great because that was where I started to get, Jordan was a very small team where I could work really collaboratively with the branding group. Every year we redid the Jordan brand mark. So I got to work on that new mark one year. I worked really closely with the marketing team. I even got to the point where my mentor was like, hey, Michael, I want you to do I'm not a huge sports person, but my mentor was like, why are you so connected to Nike, Michael? Why do you love it? And so I answered his question with a video because I didn't really know how to answer it. And I produced this internal video about what Nike meant to me. And he was like, that's great. Let's go show it to Wyden Kennedy, the ad agency. And so I started to get this understanding that industrial designers could do a lot more than industrial design because we're kind of the first creative person in the process. So if the story kind of isn't baked in from the initial onset, there's going to be kind of a disconnect. And so I saw this opportunity to kind of tell one creative story from, as I like to say, from sketch to shelf, from the very seed of an idea all the way through to the marketing communications.
That's an interesting thing that I think you kind of pointed out there is like it doesn't seem like you're putting on the shoes and going and playing basketball a lot, but you are insanely geeked out by the creative process and the creation and the design of a product and finding this this story, this legend to be the creative seed towards the voice of that design, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've always been a little bit of a misfit. So I've always loved kind of observing. And so for me, it was just getting to work with those athletes. It's like designing an F1 car. A shoe after 2 hours of Michael or Carmelo Anthony playing in it is destroyed. And so the amount of forces that these athletes are putting on it, those are just really interesting problems to solve.
Would you get these shoes back after real use? All right, here's some sneakers back from game use. Now we study them, how they failed and improve upon that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Walk me through that a bit. That's interesting. I've never heard anything about that. That's super interesting.
Well, especially at a big brand like Nike, wear testing is such a huge part. So before an athlete would ever, before a professional athlete would ever get it, there's a huge team of wear testers kind of on call to test prototypes. Right. And we'll get down to the littlest thing of does a heel rub your Achilles just a little too much, or do the laces tighten up well? And then, to go back into kind of the design process. I like to say there's this saying that writing is rewriting, and I think designing is redesigning. Right? You never just kind of hit a home run on the first pitch. It's you have to put it out there, you have to test out your ideas, you have to have it come back, and then you have to adjust from there. And I think that's just always the case. I feel very. I think maybe that's why clients enjoy working with me is I feel like there's a process. We're going to figure it out together. And I'm not one of those dogmatic designers. It's it must be this down to the millimeter. To me, it's about, us all working together to create the best solution possible.
Right. Now, with working with someone like a Michael Jordan type, what's the relationship of of understanding between someone who's so deep into design like yourself that works on an aspect of the athlete's performance so intrinsic or to their performance, like shoes? What is the relationship like between the end result client that represents the entire brand, like a Michael Jordan, to the designer? Is there a really close relationship there and a commonality of respect? Or is it more like, can you please go back and write my novel and leave me alone kind of thing? Like, what's the dynamic?
I think it's going to be really similar to architects working with clients, right? When an architect is designing a home for a client, some clients are going to want to be really involved, and some clients are just going to be like, just bring it back to me, done. And there's going to be, an infinite amount of variations in between those two poles. Sure. Michael was super involved, and he's a very product centric person, and super insightful. He's also kind of a no bullshit person, as if you watched The Last Dance, you could probably figure that out.
He's not going to beat around the bush or waste anyone's time.
Yeah. And I just remember, he liked to be talked to like a normal person, which is just really, you have to separate the fact that you're in a meeting with Michael Jordan and remove yourself from that and just be like, this is a person whose input I need. And I remember the first time I ever met with him, my boss, Dwayne Edwards, who had designed the Jordan 21, Dwayne was presenting the first prototype of the 21 to him. And Michael had thought of like 5 things in the first 10 minutes that we hadn't even thought of. And he just is he knows what he's doing.
Just immersed completely in all of it.
And he's been doing it a long time. Other athletes were maybe just more excited to get a signature shoe, so they were not as involved in it, or they just wanted to show some friends and make sure that it looked cool. But I'd say Michael was the most involved I ever worked with.
Really?
And just like, in a way, that was, once you got over the fear of it, it was super exciting, because I always went to a meeting with him knowing I was going to get some awesome ideas out of him.
That's interesting in my own work. When I work with the most demanding clients, the work is the best.
Right.
Like, you just know that, all right, I'm going to shoot this piece of architecture, and I know that architect is going to be extremely particular about everything. And it's going to be real pain and everything else, but it's going to be the best work you do.
And I always said, I kind of say that to the designers that work with me, like, this is not always going to be fun, but we're going to make the best work of your life. And I don't think I'm a mean boss by any stretch of the imagination, but I certainly have a standard. And so, there's that can be hard to deal with.
Now, how do you approach, do you have a standard approach to a design problem, no matter what it is? Is there some method that you employ to approach and find the heart of the problem that you're trying to solve?
I find that what keeps me, so I've been doing this for going on 25 years, and I feel like what keeps me interested is not having an approach. So I know kind of in general what has worked in the past. Like, every project I worked on, there's maybe been something analogous that I could pull from in terms of process. But I try to make sure that I spend enough time with the client up front to tailor a process to them, because everybody needs something totally different. Like, we've done a lot of work for Hasbro for the Transformers line. And, Hasbro is like this machine that's set up to make toys, right? So all they need from us are some really cool ideas. And literally they'll take rough sketches and some roughly laid out orthographics, and 6 months later they're like, yeah, the toy's on the shelf. Because that's all they need, because that client is set up that way.
But when you do something like that, do you go and get 30 kids in a room and watch them play and see what they gravitate to? Or are you just making toys up that you wish you had as a kid?
Yeah, I think the scope of that engagement is just totally different. It's just literally sometimes a 2-line brief and, firing back some ideas and seeing what they'll run with internally.
Wow.
Versus a client like Kirei, where where they want me to be involved with everything from, the product brief all the way through to setting up the photo shoot. And I like both ends of that spectrum. Like I call it like snacks and meals. Some projects are snacks. My work with Kirei is definitely more of a meal. Might be several meals. And added to that, the added challenge of designing products for designers, right? Like I'm trying to design a product that instead of designing something that's done, like designing this watch behind me, that's, you purchase it, it's done. I'm trying to design a product that architects can have fun with and manipulate and reshape for each one of their projects. And so there's like an added layer of as a creative, you're going to give this to another creative.
So you're designing a building block essentially at that point.
Yeah. So you have to show them enough, right? You have to show them, well, here's some ways that building block can be deployed, enough to get excited, but not so much that they're like, this is all I can do. And I love that. I mean, that's been a huge challenge. Also, in the past, like I've, whether it's designing footwear or designed a lot of consumer electronics, they're sold on the shelf at Best Buy or Target. This process is so different, right? We're designing something that has to appeal to an architect or an interior designer. They specify it, right? Like it has to go through client approvals, like so many levels. And we don't find out if we made a successful product till like 3 years later, when all of a sudden there's a bunch of orders coming.
There's a interesting relationship here between what you do and photography. When I shoot for an architect, this is interesting. When I shoot for an architect, I'm making sure that I kind of approach it like I'm building a building block, I think. And let me explain. Like, if someone looks at an architectural photo that I've done, and I've said this a lot on this, so sorry, anyone who actually watches these. If I produce a photograph of a work of architecture and someone says, what a great photograph, I've failed. If they say, what an incredible piece of architecture, I've succeeded. And there's a distinction there. Am I trying to draw attention to me, or am I facilitating someone else to show what they've created? So it's a little like how you're designing the ceiling tiles to go on to express something further. You're building a building block, right? And interestingly, like my end client being more discerning and needing me to be a little bit less of a solo act in their presentation. Like I need to not want to sing a solo in front of everybody with my photograph. I need to be part of the choir, which is the entire brand and marketing of the architectural agency representing their work, not putting me out there to sing as a solo artist, showing off this, all these tricks that I did with photography to make, it's a different thing. But then like if you're doing something like senior pictures or wedding photography, the end client can be very discerning, and you can get paid a lot of money for those things, and you can make a great living at it. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do. But all of your people who are starting out target those markets because you can do exactly what you want to do, and you'll find less of a discerning eye on the receiving end, your clients. They just need stuff that looks cool for their wedding, essentially. There's more of a market for it. So when I'm shooting something like that, which I don't really shoot anything like that anymore, but if you're shooting for a wedding client, it's more open-ended, and you get to be a little more expressive. Whereas when you're shooting for a design client, you're limited, I think. I personally limit myself more in that presentation of what I do. And I think there's a little bit of an overlap of connectivity in how you approach a project there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the architectural client has a clear message, right? They have a clear story they want to tell about the structure. Right. Where, as in an event photography, right? They want to document, and they probably want some kind of arty shots to make the memory a little glossy, right? So they're
looking for that emotional feel to be translated through the images. And I think there's far more of an emotional feel of being at that event expressed through the photographer, where an architectural photographer has to be a little more experiencing, or has to express the experience of going through this very designed and in many ways silent environment. It's kind of weird, but
Yeah. No, and I think similarly in industrial design and what I do, when you look at a piece of footwear like this, that can be incredibly expressive, right? It's on the human body. Most people have more than one pair of shoes. There's a lot more risks that can occur with this product that is so personal,
right.
like a shoe or a watch. In a car to some degree, right? Even though that's a shared object, it's still very personally expressive. And then as you kind of step out from the individual to things like, a television is like an example of a very shared product, right? Like that's the whole household shares that. And the message is kind of what's on the screen, not the device itself. Or, a piece of architecture, which can be incredibly expressive, but hopefully also outlives this one generation of people using it, so it has to kind of have a timelessness to it. And then you get to a piece of commercial architecture where there would be hundreds or thousands of people using that architecture every day, and that 1,000 people might be a different 1,000 people next year than it is today.
Right.
So I think as a creative, you just have to think of things in a different way, right? Of who is it for, and what is the intended purpose. And so for me, that part of the process, the thought process is always the same. It's that kind of curiosity, being open. And for me, I try to put my ego aside as much as possible. It's still there, but I try to just really listen to the project and understand what it wants.
Right. Now, the psychology of an individual that works creatively is something that really interests me, that I'm trying to understand more, just to understand myself more too. Someone like yourself, in what you do, you have to go into chaos. You have to identify where is there not order that we want order, and you have to be open to that, and you have to go somehow interact with all the potential of what that thing could be, and then you have to turn it into something through your hand and a pencil and some paper or a computer, and then you have to bring it back and say, here's something that I think is going to work well for you, of further concrete utility out of the abstract. How much of your own personal life are you very open in your approach to? And I'm not saying tell me about your, but open as in like, as a political statement, people who are open to how the politics and running of a country and society, those type of people have openness in that respect. While someone can be politically conservative, but still be very open and creative when they approach design. Now, interestingly, a lot of times, if you're open and working as a creative, it does many times mean that you will also identify politically in the same manner. And I wonder that what are the people doing that identify as more conservative politically? What do they do for jobs typically, and back and forth? But the psychology of going into that chaos, bringing something out of further order, how much do you understand of your own personality that plays a beneficial role in that? And also, what are the things in your personality that you have to take charge of and actually control a bit more, because they're not conducive to being a good designer? Like I know I have aspects of my own life that I have to look at and say, this isn't the best for that, so I'm going to have to work on that to be better at this. Like, how do you work your life and your own internal existence in relation to what you do?
Yeah, I think my biggest strength is I'm someone who kind of always likes to move forward, and as one of my mentors used to always say, Michael, at a certain point, you have to take it from what it can be to what it will be. And I've just always been that person who loves to just jump into the deep end of ambiguity. I look for ambiguity. That's where like the coolest opportunities are, when people don't know what to do.
Right.
I try to jump into that and quickly start moving through it to help define what it will be. And this can be really painful for clients, right? They get a lot of analysis paralysis. Those people that tend to be maybe a little more conservatively minded, a little bit more focused on things like metrics and measurables. It's like at some point you have to just look at all the data, and we have to make our best intuitive guess. And guess is a terrible word, but I think of intuition as the multiplicative effect of skill times experience, right? So I have a high skill level. I also have 25 years of experience. I can multiply those two things together to move a project forward.
Right.
And sometimes, a client can be, very scared. And if I'm doing my job right, they should be scared. I remember presenting work to a client, and he was like, Michael, I've never seen anything like this before. And I was like, hey, put an exclamation mark at the end of that statement. And he's like, what do you mean? Instead of saying, I've never seen anything like this before with fear, exclaim it.
Wow.
And he's like, I've never seen anything like this before. I'm like, right, that's what you paid me for. If I brought you a bunch of things you had
Did
seen
you actually
before,
say that in that instance?
Yeah.
Good job.
And I was like, if I had brought you a bunch of things you had already seen, you should fire me. Why would you pay someone my rates for things that just made you feel good and comfortable? I want to show you what your industry can be. I'm going to push you towards that so that you can be an industry leader. And so that's why I always frame myself as a consultant. A contractor's job is to do a task for you. A consultant's job is to help tell you what to do. And I look at it as like, if my client is paying me to tell them what the weather is outside, and it's 32 degrees and sleeting, I'm not going to go tell them it's 72 degrees and sunny, no matter how much they might want to hear that. I have to tell them the hard truth about their brand, about their products, about their capabilities, because I have to consider all those things when I'm pitching solutions, right? Like I might be pitching what might be a great solution for the marketplace or for the end user, but if the client doesn't have the capability to execute it, well, what am I doing? It's not a good solution for them.
You're essentially making statements that are unable to be substantiated, that you're saying this will be great. Here's my representation of what it's going to be. It's going to be great, but we've never seen that be great before. You've never seen this before. That's why you're paying me to come up with it.
Right.
So you have to have a seemingly absurd amount of self-confidence to handle yourself like that in a meeting. And I say that in a amazing way. Like that's real. That's true. And how do you get to that point of saying, there's no right or wrong answer here, but I know this is as close to right as you're going to get with me working on this, and it's good. And by the way, the invoice is in the mail, and
I think again, like it's a lot of just observing the client, observing their market. With the work with Kirei, we talk a lot to architects and interior designers. We talk a lot to the sales reps. And so kind of building that foundation of these different data points. And I think that's the value of a nonlinear thinker, right? It's like, I could take this point of data from operations and this point of data from sales and this point of data from trends I see that architects, how they've been specifying things and how that's been changing, right? Like how hospitality is influencing workplace design, for example. And then take these 5 totally unrelated, seemingly unrelated things and be like, and here's a solution based on all 5 of those pillars.
That's almost a math problem. It's like you're taking true factual data points. And if you can get as many as possible, it helps you connect the dots for the real picture of what
Right.
you're. Yeah. Okay.
And we have to kind of, I love the word synthesis. It's like this idea of like taking all these totally different things and synthesizing it together and be like, here's the thing you never thought of. It
Right.
came from all
Right.
the things you told me, but
Right.
I put it together in a way you didn't think of because I'm not as close to it. And I think
Right.
that's part of the key as well. Like, again, thinking back on my time at Nike, I was there about 8 years. The first 3 shoes I ever designed for Nike were featured in Metropolis magazine as the future of footwear. And I don't think I ever replicated that again because I was breaking rules that I didn't know even existed. I was like, one of the shoes was inspired by, I was on a trip, research trip, and I was taking the train from London to Paris. And I saw this woman running to catch the train in a pair of high heels. And I was like, we should make a shoe for her. She's running. She's not running a marathon, but she's running from after work in London on a Friday to catch the train to Paris for the weekend. And we should design a pair of shoes that fold up and fit in her purse and fit in a nice little bag. And I think, I brought that idea back, and the engineers, I think, were like, this kid's nuts. But I didn't know enough to limit myself. And by the time I was there for 8 years, I found myself just really editing down my ideas before I even pitched them.
Right.
And I was like, this is dangerous. I'm going to I know too much of what I'm doing.
So did you intentionally remove yourself from a situation where you were producing good results because you knew that you were starting to fall back on a predictable method?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean, that being comfortable in ambiguity. Well,
Yeah.
I wasn't in ambiguity anymore. And so I was now becoming uncomfortable because things were getting too predictable.
Right.
And so, I left Nike to be creative director of a firm called Frog Design in San Francisco. Frog Design designed the original Apple Macintosh. They designed the original Sony Walkman.
Oh, wow.
Did a ton of work for Google, Motorola, Intel, really got steeped into consumer electronics, which couldn't be more different than footwear. And eventually went in-house to a large conglomerate that owns 6 or 7 different audio brands. And there I started putting together all these different things. The first speaker I did for that brand was this AirPlay speaker, but instead of looking like a black brick like everything else, the top was a pressure-formed piece of laminated mahogany with a white grill and kind of brass buttons. And I remember presenting it to Best Buy, and they're like, this doesn't look like anything else in the store. I'm like, no, but it looks like a lot of things in your home, because this isn't about creating a black rectangle that sits on a shelf at Best Buy. The final resting place for this device isn't a store shelf. The final resting place for this device is someone's living room next to an Eames Barca lounger and a nice shelf and a coffee table and a beautiful rug. And
it didn't end up like that little thing behind you to your left at all, did it?
It is a little. It does look like that a little bit. I'll have to send you a picture of it. It was called the Polk Woodburn.
Oh, Polk audio's nice stuff.
Yeah, and it was just, I felt like understanding that this device had to earn the right to be in your living room. Right, it was a $700 device,
right,
and it couldn't look like a glossy black brick.
How much of your thought process and opinion goes into actually pricing out an end product, or does the consumer come, or the client come to you and say, we're looking to develop a speaker at this price point, kind of thing?
It depends, it totally depends on the client and the project. Sometimes it's really important to hit a price point, right? Where you're like, hey, this is, we're trying to create an $80 product. And sometimes the client is saying, we need a flagship. We need something that is going to totally push our industry. And so we'll price it later.
Right. An interesting thing to me that I've seen is like the evolution of Kia. Kia was crap.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden their cars are like, wait, what's that? It's like, whoa, there's a Kia badge on that. What's going on? And it's like car manufacturers seem to understand this to some degree, where they'll stagnate to the point of irrelevance and they're forced to this point of saying, all right, now we've got to reimagine our design process. And it's still 4 wheels, 4 doors, a trunk, a hood. Boring as anything, but they reinvent it. And it's like all of a sudden they invest in the creativity and the concept of someone seemingly outside of their market to come in and change the whole thing. And it becomes this, like, before it was like, ew, I don't want to get any of that Kia on me, and now it's like, that's pretty nice, actually. It's really interesting to me to see that the value of that, even in our marketplace, that they establish something, they go with it far enough until it doesn't work, and then it forces them to, like, all right, we have to update and we have to get creative here. I wonder why brands don't do that all the time. Like, what's the psychology of not doing that all the time? It's this, like you were saying, I guess, I think brands get comfortable and they stagnate to the point of failure, and then they have to be revamped. So you saw yourself stagnating at, like, Nike, the best, like, incredible, and you're like, well, I've got to move on, even though I'm, assumably very well paid and doing great and having access to people like Michael Stinky Jordan. And then you're like, no, I don't want to stagnate. Sorry, see you guys.
I think it's also incredibly human driven, so Peter Schrier, who used to be head of design of the Volkswagen Group through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. So he was head of design at Volkswagen, Audi, Bugatti. He had this 20-year plan for Audi, because the same, Audi in the 80s was kind of a garbage brand, right? Audi 5000, nobody wanted that. But he had this really long-term plan that basically culminated in the early 2000s, TT, A4, A6, beautiful design language. That brand became, the number 3, luxury German auto brand, right? It's like BMW and Mercedes were the 2. And then all of a sudden it was BMW, Mercedes, Audi. Mm-hmm. And then, Peter left after, I think, 25 years plus at Volkswagen. Where did he go to become chief design officer? He could have probably gone to Ferrari or any huge, amazing brand. He went to Kia. And
that's why they're incredible now.
What took him 20 years at Volkswagen, Audi took him 5 years at Kia.
That's amazing.
And so and I remember with the first products that his team worked on that came out of Kia. I'm forgetting the name of their kind of like mid-level sedan, but I was just like, wow, that's really nice. And then the Kia Stinger came out.
The Stinger, yeah.
I remember saying to friends, I'm like, Kia is that's the new Volkswagen Audi group. And they're like, no, I would never buy a Stinger. I would never buy a Kia. 3 years later, they're like, yeah, I think I'll buy a Kia. So right. It doesn't take that long, because eventually there's a lot of, there's some resistance, right? Perception lags reality. I learned that early in my career working on watches for Timex that were too progressive for that brand. But eventually, if you stick with the strategy, the product will overcome all. Because at the end of the day, after somebody decides what to buy, after they throw away the packaging, at the end, what they live with is the end product, whether that's a building or a car or a watch. And that will overcome any other messages they're fed over time.
Yeah, I was in Ojai, California, probably 4 or 5 years ago, and behind the coffee shop where we were at, they were doing like a review video or something on a Stinger, and that's the first one I had seen. Yeah. And like they had all the cameras and everything, and both my friend and I were like, "Whoa, what's that?" And that was like the moment I was like, "A Kia?" That I was like, "Whoa, that's really incredible." That like I picked up on that. Like Kia went whoop, and the guy that actually made it go whoop.
Yeah, I mean, look at like the amazing thing too is you think of like Ford and General Motors are like, there's no money in sedans anymore. We're not going to make them. And then you have Kia. You're like, oh really? Because here's a full size 350 horsepower sedan, and it's selling. Yeah. So it's like, well, maybe people just wanted a sedan that they liked.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think Toyota Corolla and Camry right now, the Camry to me looks fairly aggressive. If they put Stinger type performance and made like a performance package Camry, I would be like, like an M3 competitor type thing. Like Toyota could do that. That'd be pretty awesome.
And
You made me go
I
ahead.
also think like design, it's always my goal that design never tells lies, and I think one of the things I loved about working at Nike was design's job to always kind of exaggerate function, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the Nike Air predates the visible bubble. They had the Air Pocket inside shoes for a long time.
My mom had a pair of those where you could take the insole out and it was a little bluish little heel cushion.
But nobody could see it, and so it cost more, didn't sell very well, and basically two guys, Tinker Hatfield, who designed Jordans 3 through 15, and Mark Parker, who ended up becoming CEO of the company. They were both basically entry-level employees at the time. They're like, why don't we make the Air thing visible? And so I love this idea of, taking what is functional and exaggerating it to the point where it becomes a design story. And so that's what I try to do with Kirei. Like, instead of hiding the architectural panels, I want to make them something that an architect is like, let's make this a showcase. These panels are so cool. These baffles, these ceiling clouds, like we can actually make this a part of supporting our theme versus, oh God, we got to like stuff these things in there and hide them. And so, it's my goal to really accentuate function to the point where it becomes kind of an artistic expression. And you can create something instead of being like, oh, that stuff. You could make people be like, what is that? That is so cool. Like, oh, actually, it improves the acoustics.
I might be sticking my foot in my mouth and doing a faux pas here, but I had recently shot an office space that incorporated these acoustic ceiling tiles that they're just a curve, but in and of themselves, they almost look like the profile of a bird.
Okay.
And I don't know if those are the brand that you were working with or not, but it's like pronounced when you look at them, it looks like a flock of flying birds almost.
Oh, cool.
But they've got this nice, it's really thick felt and they're curved to look like wings and a body essentially, but it's a very, very simple form mimicry, but not like in a triangular way or anything else. But it's just kind of like, it's a moment where you're like, oh, like even the shape is functional because it distributes the audio quality and everything else. And really cool, and I'm sure very similar to the other thing, if not from that company. I had a question. What distinguishes bad design for you? Like, what are when you look at something and you're like, oh, they had an untalented designer. What are the cues like to see? Bad. Like, I can pick that out for architectural photography because I'm doing it all the time. I know you've got to be able to pick it out, but I know you probably don't want to shame people either. But knowing why things don't work tells you about how to do it right, how to spot it, how to grow. Like, how do you identify bad design?
And it's a curse, right? I mean, I remember once I was in a coffee shop with my wife, Christina, and, I was just looking around and she's like, what's wrong? Do we need to go? And I was just like, like, those 3 lights are all different temperatures. Those 2 panels don't fit. Why these chairs don't match the theme? Like, I just can't even be in here right now. And so it's a real curse sometimes to have that eye because you're like, oh God, there's like 10 mistakes too many in here for me to be here. For me, I think, there's a lot of design that is just non-memorable, and to me that's almost worse than bad design. Like, at least when somebody tries and spectacularly fails, you're like, well, they tried. But it's kind of the stuff that's just so safe that's just like to me is just a lack of conviction that really kills me.
Like, there's an opportunity and you didn't take it.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, I think bad design, quote unquote bad design, is often when something just doesn't quite fit. Like, someone didn't really understand the situation. You see a lot of like what sometimes people call over designed, things that are very busy. I think of it, there's that old saying, like, sorry, my letter was so long, I didn't have time to write a short one.
Yeah, I think that's a Mark Twain saying.
Yeah, I believe so. And so I think really, really good design, or maybe the difference between good and great design, is just having that time to really look at it and be like, is everything here really need to be here? Can I take something away? Am I missing something? Am I missing an opportunity? And honestly, that just takes time, right?
Do you work in a reductive process sometimes? Because like when I'm setting up a scene to shoot, I'll start from the most simplistic 1-point perspective. And if it's great, we stay there and then we start eliminating things from the scene until it feels empty. And then once it feels empty, then we just barely start to add things back in to make it feel right. If the 1 point doesn't work, we break it a little bit, go here or there. Do you work in a reductive manner with design, and how do you do that when you're only sketching ideas at first, right?
I do, and it's just by just developing a lot of options, and then I also try to honestly like leave room. So the development process for a product is long, typically at least a year, sometimes 2 or 3 years, depending on the product. And in that development process, like things are going to come up that you didn't think of, like, oh, we can't make it that way, we need to do this, or what have you. And so I try to leave the product like one notch simpler than maybe I know it will be, knowing that as we work through the process, things will come up when we need to add a part line or a second material, or oh, actually there needs to be a track on this baffle to get it to install right. And so it will kind of come up to the level of detail that it needs to throughout the process. And I think a lot of that just comes from experience. Just working through, at this point, thousands of products to production, and understanding like there's going to be kind of some natural levels of complication that happens. Let's put it this way: it's probably not going to get simpler in the process.
Right. So in your industry, to relate it to the industry that I most know, you're the designer, and then you send it off to the builder or the factory essentially to like, how can this be made? Well, this idiot designer thought you could do this, and we're going to do it this, because there's always this not disconnect, but this conflict tension between the designer having an idealized idea of this home, and then the builder like, you can't build it that way. Well, no, you can. Here's the drawings. You can do it. And there's always that tension of, why are we even doing it this way? That's, I think, in the building industry sometimes a little harder to communicate, because your whole project depends on sometimes one single person's budget, whereas what you're doing is multiplied across potentially millions of units, right? So it's a different thing.
Which is scary, because in my business, the biggest barrier is tooling, right? You have to create a tool that makes the product, and that tool can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes $1 million. And so if the client is like, well, we can't amortize that tool over X amount of widgets, it's not going to happen. So giving them that confidence. But yeah, it's very similar. And like an architect working with builders, I like to bring in our case, manufacturing, right? Whether that's a contract manufacturer for the client or in-house manufacturer. I like to work with those people in the process as much as possible, so that when we're reviewing ideas, I get their buy-in at least enough that, like, hey, you were in the room when this was approved. You had your chance to speak out. Or,
so you have a
representative please raise your
objections from the manufacturer, kind of like in design meetings, you'd have a rep from the builder. And
hey, like, please voice your objections, because we'll design for them. But if you don't voice them, I can't design for. I can't know the process, the manufacturing process or the building process as intimately as you do. That's your job. So I need them in the room with me. And sometimes that's where the cool ideas come from. Like, sometimes it's like, oh, well, we can't build it like that, Michael, but we could do this. I'm like, well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. And so again, that openness, like you talked about, that like ability to just be like, oh, okay, well, I hadn't thought of that. Like, what could I do with that? That's interesting. And so I again, been doing this long enough to know have the antennas up and listening for those moments, because that's where like the coolest stuff happens in my experience.
So in my career, I have all these kind of dream opportunities in front of me still that are kind of the ones like, when it happens, I check it off. I get a little deflated after that because I accomplished something, and you've just lost a dream, but you've also accomplished a dream. So there's a little like, yay, but there's a little bit of a downer there. It's weird. But
I understand.
In front of you, what are the big hopes and dreams? It's the type of thing you could design and bring into the world, essentially.
Yeah. Sometimes I get excited by the seemingly most mundane things. I worked on an RFP for San Francisco to redesign the traffic meters, and somebody I was working with is like, Michael, why are you so excited about this traffic meter?
What
like
is a traffic meter?
Like a parking meter. Sorry.
Okay,
yeah.
Kirei, sorry.
Yeah. So I was like, he's like, why are you so excited about these parking meters? I'm like, because it's so like this could be everywhere, all over this whole city. Like, how cool is that? And if we do it right, we'll have created this object that adds to the landscape of San Francisco.
Right.
And if we do it wrong, we'll have created this thing that everybody hates. So that's exciting to me, even though it's this very simple object.
Yeah, and it's a thing that most everyone is not going to want to interact with. So the bar is extremely high, and you've obviously been very successful at jumping over these bars. So with here's a thing that no one wants to interact with. Can I make it something that improves someone's day just through the design and weirdness and fun and that? Yeah, that's a really hard challenge there.
I remember one of my favorite shoes I worked on was this Jordan called the T4G, the Train for Greatness. It was just a training shoe, not a on-court Jordan, and nobody wanted to work on it. I was like, I'll do that. I want to do that project. And my boss is like, why do you want to do that project? I'm like, because no one is expecting anything from it. So that means I have the most opportunity to do whatever I want with it. And I remember like 5 years later seeing that shoe like on somebody's street, on somebody's feet on the streets in Boston, and being like, because they only made that shoe for like 4 months. So I'm like, that dude kept that shoe for 5 years and like just pulls it out of the box every once in a while. I love projects like that. For me, I think I've worked in almost every industry. I think some of the ones that I haven't worked in that I really would love to is furniture, doing some contract furniture. And I have so many ideas for furniture. In architecture, I've done some conceptual architecture for a developer down in Southern California, which was really fun. But nothing that's gotten built. So that would be, and that was a collaboration with an architect, which was super fun.
Tell me more about your ideas for furniture and why you're interested in that specifically.
Well, I think I'm fascinated by what I call kind of single taskers. So products that only have one function, and that function is fairly defined, and there's almost an unlimited amount of options for that object. I think of something like, perfect example is a watch, right? Like you can buy a watch for $300,000 and you can get a watch for free on watch day at Yankee Stadium.
Right.
So there's literally every price point imaginable. They all tell time within 1 second of each other, right? Otherwise it wouldn't be a watch. And yet the market, people have this kind of almost unlimited appetite for new designs in that area. And so things like that just kind of fascinate me, more the psychology of them. And I think chairs fit into that category. Like we don't need any new chairs. There's a lot of great chair options, but yet every year, Herman Miller and Steelcase and every residential brand launches new chairs, and we want them. So I'm fascinated by the psychology behind that. And of course, there's always functional improvements you can make. There's always new manufacturing techniques you could riff off of. But that doesn't explain the illogical desire for a beautiful chair.
So what chairs do you have at your dining room and in your living room? Which ones have you chosen?
Yeah. So I hate to be like incredibly predictable, but my dining room, I can look over towards it is,
You've got some Herman Millers there probably.
Yeah, 6 Eiffel Eames shell chairs. For my sofa, I had this, one of my classmates I went to Rhode Island School of Design. One of my classmates, Nick Didziak, he designed a sofa for design within reach that I have, which is one of the few new sofas you could find that have like a beautiful back, because it's, if you have a sofa that's not against a wall, you want the back to be beautiful. I'm sitting in a steel case Series 2 chair, or Series 1 actually. I think as a designer, I think of the same as like when I'm going out to eat too. It's like, if I'm doing any kind of interaction where I'm consuming something from another creative, I want to think about it as much as I would hope someone would think about the things that I'm designing. So luckily, my wife's been with me since I was 19, so for a long time. She knows, like, if we need a new spatula, this is like an event. It's going to take time. So,
Right. Oh, that's hilarious. Now, do you think that people actually want to be thinking about what they're using while they're using it? You do.
Yeah, I think that I think that they don't want to be thinking about it consciously, right? But I think there's a lot of subconscious things that people absorb all the time. And, they might not understand, like we talked about the coffee shop that had different temperature lights. Well, a normal person, quote unquote normal, might not observe the different temperatures of the lighting. They just might not feel right in there to them. They might not know why. They don't articulate it. And so in a weird way, good design in that scenario where the lighting was all the same temperature, the chairs matched the space, the construction quality was better, would have been more invisible, right? Like a good haircut, right?
Yeah.
But it would have made maybe just the whole experience a bit more pleasurable.
People will subconsciously gravitate towards those experiences while not knowing exactly why, maybe.
Yeah, and so that's my goals are kind of two-part. Like, can I do something that facilitates a little bit more joy in somebody's life, right? Whether they're aware of it or not. Maybe it's just doing its job modestly, and they're going about living their life with their family. And then secondly, how can I put kind of the values of our culture into an object to create an artifact, right? Because that's basically our job. Like the architects, the buildings that architects are designing, the products I'm designing, the images that you're taking are artifacts that some future generation is going to look back on and be like, this is what these people cared about.
That's interesting. I haven't really realized it in that way, that we are, with everything we do, we're putting into those things the values of our culture. That's interesting.
Yeah, whether we mean to or not, right? And I think it's like you go to like the Egyptian art floor at the Met in New York, and most of the things on that floor are everyday objects from that time. And so, our everyday objects, this pen or what have you, will take on the same meaning to future generations. And I'm not trying to be like put us on a pedestal or anything as creators. I'm just trying to be aware of it.
Right. I mean, you're a translator, essentially. You're translating the values of our culture into the products of now. And it's what we'll leave behind, that people will decipher the values and meaning of our culture and everything else by sifting through these products we leave behind, essentially. Because if you look at, everything from Egypt that you'd have, it seems like almost everything they have just relates constantly to this more mystical kind of thing surrounding Egypt, right? It's like, oh, this spatula, has the god of Horus or something carved on it. It means, And what is being said by our things, the things we surround ourselves with? What is being said by that? That we're just completely profit driven, or that we're completely survival driven, or that we're just like, have we lost the view of the mystical and none of that makes it onto our spatulas anymore, But what are we saying with all those choices that we make? What are the ideals and thoughts that are brought into those products, you think?
And I think we're going to do that whether we mean to or not. As a creative person, you can't help, if you're a musician, you can't help but respond to the other music that's happening around you.
Right.
And so I think we might as well do it with intention and be thinking about that a little bit, right? Like you look at like the overall driving aesthetic over the decades. It's hard to see when you're in it, right? But you can put together a narrative around the 70s, the 80s, the 90s based on the aesthetics of that time. And then the drive towards minimalism in the 2000s. And you're like, okay, what was happening? It's like, well, people were shifting to more of these digital lives. Physical objects were becoming simpler, right? The more complex and crazy the world is getting, there's this desire for quiet, visual quiet. And so then you're like, well, how do I then like chart that forward, right? From Memphis in the 80s to all the crazy deconstruction that was going on in the 90s to this quiet minimalism in the 2000s. Well, I know it's going to keep changing because that's the only thing I could be certain of, is that it will continue to change. But how can I connect the dots to predict the future a little bit?
Yeah, that's an interesting one that you have a lot more insight on it than I do. I'm left with no comment.
I think there's gonna be this, especially coming out of this pandemic. I think I call it this kind of push for coziness or the friendly future. Like the future has become really scary, and so I think there's this desire to create these cocoons, right? We've all been working in these kind of home office situations for 2 years. And now I'm going to have to go back to an open plan, echoey office. Like, nah, like I want it to feel like home. I want it to be comfortable. I want to feel safe. This kind of, I've heard it called the aesthetics of care. And I don't think that, white minimalism fits that. Right. So I think we're going to be I think we're already living through a shift to this kind of softer, more friendly space.
It's interesting that we live in these times that are, they feel scary because of like the political situation, which you would never have said like back in the 80s or even early 90s about our own country. You would have watched elections in other countries and thought, glad we don't have to go through that. And now we're looking at our own country like, what has gone wrong here? That's an interesting one. Another question or realization that I had from something you're saying is creative and artist are similar, but artist has more of a personal expression within their creativity. And I wonder, do good artists miss their time in history where they could have been an incredible artist, but simply what they personally focused on or were going through did not necessarily tap into the collective experience at that time? So they could have been influential, essentially on the same level as a Van Gogh or whatever, but what they were going through wasn't common in that time frame. So they had the ability to express and everything else, and they were saying something authentic and doing it well, but it wasn't touching the nerve of what was going on in the society at the time. So it just wasn't received. And I wonder if we come across those type of artists after the fact and then bring them into our current culture sometimes as well.
I think that happens all the time with creatives, across the spectrum, where you see something and you're like, oh, there's a kernel there, but it's not there yet. It's not ready. The world's not ready for that yet. And I think the history is littered with, geniuses that were ahead of their time, that saw something a little too early and maybe just didn't know how to make it quite relevant for the time they were living in. And Van Gogh is, a great example of that, right? He wasn't famous till after he passed.
Right.
And I think it's as a designer, part of our job is to consider that. Like, okay, like I hopefully see where I have a sense of where this is all going, but I might need to pull it back a little bit so that it's ready to be deployed now, because at the end of the day, if I'm not making something that people relate to, that people enjoy, what am I doing? That's that's my job.
Right.
I remember one of my best days as a designer. I was on the BART train in San Francisco, and my wife was like, "Why are you being all weird right now?" And I was like, "There's 6 dudes on this train wearing shoes I designed." And so for me,
how were you acting? Like, what could she pick up on?
I was just looking around, like
she really picks up on. She knows she has a special monkey on her team.
Yeah.
That's very different than most everyone in the world, and she sees that, and she because you mentioned like you were in a coffee shop, and she like knows. Oh, you're having one of your moments, aren't you? Right. Like, I can't this stuff, man. And and then that's really interesting. On a personal level, that's interesting to see.
But to me, that's better than any design award, right? That's better than anything else. It's just seeing people enjoy the things we work on in our time, and we're very, very fortunate.
Did you say anything to the people wearing your shoes?
No.
Do you ever?
Do. No.
Why not?
Because I just quietly. I just am just enjoying that moment, and that's happened to me many times. I remember dropping my car off at the mechanic once, and the mechanic is wearing a watch I designed, and just being like, "Huh, that's cool." Out of all a world full of watches, he picked one that I designed, and that's just the best. I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to like sully it with like my ego getting into that moment. I just
huh. Yeah, that's insightful and wise and interesting. Wow. I had something else I was going to ask you that was interesting, but then I got sidetracked and chased a squirrel, a mental squirrel. Let's see if I can remember it. If I try and remember it, it runs further away. That's weird.
I know what you mean. Slippery
mental slope. So, we've been talking for about an hour and 15 minutes, which is a good stretch for normal people, but you're not exactly normal in your talent level. So, pulling away from all this, what complexities do you have in your life, you think, because of your abilities? I can spot complexities and difficulties in my life that arise because I was not aware of the flip side of what talent I do have. Mm-hmm. Have you found like the flip side of your skill? It leaves you shortchanged, or like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I think I've learned to have a simple life. I think it's Oscar Wilde saying that he said he likes to hang out with bad poets because they lead the lives that you think interesting poets lead. And I think the same with kind of like good designers, or at least in my case, is true. Like
you just offended a bunch of your friends right now.
I know, but I like nice things. I like to travel, but mostly my life is just about just having great moments with my wife and our dog and our extended family, my nephew, my brother, my sister-in-law. I like, as I like to say, I save the creativity for the clients. Like, I don't dress all wacky or, it's just like, I think I probably would just look like a normal, geek chic, nerdy dude walking down the street of Portland, drinking overpriced coffee, like everybody else. And so, but I kind of pride myself on that. I want to be a little bit invisible, and I want my work to speak. Right. But I think it took me a long time to get there. I feel like when I was working corporate prior to setting up my own practice 5 years ago, when I was chief design officer, like I couldn't have enough fancy watches or fast cars and what have you. But as soon as I started my own practice, I just like didn't need any of that stuff anymore, because I was just so fulfilled in my work and just chasing that occupied all my thoughts. And
Now,
I just,
why did being independently, like your own deal
yeah.
consultant, why did that do that to you rather than being on a payroll?
I think I just was allowed to be the person I wanted to be, right? Like I can talk to you.
So the person you wanted to be wanted less material things?
I guess so. I don't know, but I think the person I wanted to be was just, I can talk to you and not worry about what I'm going to say, or,
Right, right.
I just had more freedom. And as soon as I had that freedom, I had more of a sense of fulfillment. And as soon as I had that sense of fulfillment, I chased less things. That's at least how it worked for me. Everybody's different.
Interesting. No, that's a really interesting point, because I was just having this conversation with my wife this morning about I struggle with like my own personal, like I make my living in a very creative manner. I'm a commercially creative individual. That I'm not an artist in what I get paid for. I approach something creatively and produce an end result that is beneficial to the client, that they get to use to get more business, yada yada yada. But it is something that I cannot necessarily pass my business that I've created off to my children. It's not like an electrician or plumber
Right.
or anything that can be done right or wrong. It's this subjective observation process turned into a thing that you can hand over to someone, essentially. And teaching your children, or inspiring others even, to become self-employed, to me, when you said like there's a difference in you from being employed to being self-employed, is what you said, essentially, not
Yeah.
technically, right?
No, for sure.
And that being self-employed, what is it about that there's a spark in someone that's self-employed that isn't in someone who's employed, but there's less of an outward spark in you as far as the flashy watch and the fast car
Right.
and everything else. That stuff isn't there when you're self-employed. Like, that's an interesting dynamic to me. And to get down to it, I was talking to my wife about how sometimes I feel like I want to inspire my kids to absolutely be self-employed, entrepreneurial, because it's, in my opinion, much safer to know how to land on your own feet and take care of yourself rather than rely on someone else for constant, paycheck kind of thing. But then I have this conflict of, well, maybe they're not of the personality type to be able to do their own thing. And I'm still at that point, like, should I teach my children to be ruthlessly entrepreneurial regardless? Like, are we in that time where they need to be that way or can't be that way? I don't know. It's an interesting thing that when you said that, it kind of like, ooh, I was just talking about this. But
Yeah.
I remembered the question I was going to ask you earlier. How do you approach art, being so incredibly introspective and thoughtful about seemingly everything going on around you and why it's happening? Because you have to know why things are happening, how people do things, why they do things, that you venture into that chaos and take all of that and create a solution. That's a lot. And you work so intensively creatively like that. How do you approach art, someone else's expression through a creative means of their own vision? Like, do you relate to art, you think, maybe differently than a standard person who's crunching just numbers? Or like, what do you think of that?
I don't know. It's a hard one to answer. My wife's an artist, so it's we're kind of very immersed into the art world here, and I would say most of our friends are either designers or artists. So, for me, when I look at art, it's a very personal thing, and obviously, I certainly have an aesthetic that I gravitate towards, right? In terms of like, I tend to gravitate towards kind of mid-century ethos in general, but the kind of the colors and shapes and more abstract things that just speak to me. But a lot of it is personal.
Do you
And
think, like, I as well have no interest really in li- art that is literal in any way other, like abstraction to me is very inspiring. Do
mhm.
you think that's some kind of connection of knowing where your potential as an individual lies?
I think so. And even, I mean, I was actually on the board of an organization in Southern California for photographers for a while, a nonprofit. And one of my friends who founded that organization, Scott B. Davis, is this incredible kind of desert photographer. But everything he does is kind of abstract.
Hmm.
It communicates a feeling, you know. Um, and yeah, I tend to just kind of, again, maybe it's just my comfort in ambiguity, but I like things that are very open ended. Um, and so, yeah, when I go to a museum, you know, I might walk through 90% of it in 10 minutes and then stand in front of one painting for
Mm,
45.
interesting.
So it just has to kind of talk to me, and
Yeah.
I let my intuition guide me, and then and the design process is somewhat like this too. I let my intuition guide me, and then then I'll ask myself, well, why did I like that, right? And
Hmm.
then try to pick it apart, but only after I let my intuition guide me to it.
Right. Yeah. That the thing you said there, I forget exactly what it was, but this idea that you're a creator of concrete things whose
Mhm.
comfort is in ambiguity.
It's true.
That's so like oddly contradiction held within the same person. Not really, because you're drawn to feeling comfortable in the ambiguity and inspired by the ambiguity, but what you produce is not more ambiguity.
No,
You love
no.
ambiguity and you love to create concrete ideas out of the ambiguity.
Yeah, I like
And
reach
that's,
into it and pull something out, right?
yeah,
It's the magic and the rabbit out of the hat moment.
right, right. I've never seen that before.
Right.
Great. I'll up my bill then.
Right.
That's interesting. Well, this has been really interesting. I'm always taken back by there's some people you can talk to that, and I was just someone called me this morning talking about they were thinking about starting a podcast, and I was trying to define why some guests are good and some you have to pull more out of, and it's always the individuals that have looked uh, beyond the surface of the talent at what they're good at or whatever thing they're doing that they've gotten to be good at. They go from good to great when they reach good and get bored and have to realize there's got to be more driving than this, than just executing, however
Right.
many years you were at Nike, right? You get to a point and you're like, if this is going beyond, I've got to look internally and I've got to really understand the relationship in me and outside of me and what all that connective thing is to then be able to refocus on this thing and take it to the next level. And that deep self introspection and that deep introspection and thought process about everything going on around you, you can get people that are good at executing things, but it seems like when people are really bringing that great thing to the table, the thing that no one's seen before, that actually touches people and they're like, whoa, I haven't seen that, but it rings true. Like they've never seen it. How would they know it rings true? Because of the million data points within the thing that you've already thought about, that you translated into the thing that then creates that, and that's, thank you for being a good guest.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's something to that sense of like a good solution feels obvious after you see it.
Right.
You would never have known you wanted it. You would never have predicted it. But once you see it, you're like, oh, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what I'm going for. I think with a lot of my work, where you just look at it and you're like, that's the thing it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of
Thanks
like
for
you stumble across it and it's unavoidable once you see it.
right.
And I do that with my photography, especially
Yeah.
when I was starting out. I'd shoot a lot just out of reaction. and I'd have to go back and look at everything, and I'd have to see, like, going through a museum, there's 90 of them or 100, and only 10 of them like speak to me. That's like, it's not just the shooting, it's also the selection and editing out process that all of a sudden this one speaks to you. Why does it speak to you? I don't know. Think about it. And you just go through it, and I find the ones that really connect to me, I'll put on my phone, and I'll look at them like tons of times during the day, and I'll look at it before I go to bed. And it's like my mind thinks about the relationship of the graphic design just on a screen of what was captured and why that's good. And then the next time you're in a situation where those types of elements cross each other again, it's like a key just turns in your head and you see it. And no matter if it's a bike or a desk or a radio or a speaker or whatever, there's similarity in its presence and in its language. And when that language clicks, you kind of see it, and you just know, like, oh, I've gone through this before, I'll do it again. And it just kind of happens. You know it. But anyways, it's been really nice talking to you. It's I don't think I've spoken to an industrial designer, nor someone who sat in the presence of Michael Jordan. So
Well, thanks for having me on. It was really awesome talking to you, Trent. I think we probably could have, if we had some coffee or some beers, gone a few more hours. So I appreciate it.
You're based in Portland currently, or that's where you live, out on the West Coast? How are things out there recently? And everyone staying safe and like the rest of the country?
We're doing our best.
Cool. Well, I really appreciated talking to you. I really appreciate how your mind works. Obviously, you're very passionate about what you're doing, and that's just so great to interact and come across people who are just immersed, helplessly immersed in what they're doing. That is really cool. So thank you.
Thanks, Trent.